like Antarctica. It don't matter if you black and white, says the man in the mirror. The squad's facing the terror. I'm talking mother, father, sister, brother, grandma, and grandpapa. All doomed cause of skin color. Paranoid like my mind playing tricks on this ghetto boys. So I gotta scream for my mama like I'm George Floyd. Now I'm all in linen like John Imagine it. But he ain't give peace a chance, he took 8 lives with him. Where the love goes still unanswered. Politicians, they be flipping Gabby Douglas. Device so they could conquer, then they chain our ancestors. Come together like the Beatles remastered. What if we went a little bit out of our way? Stop the hatred. Imagine that. Stop the hatred. What if we went? What if we took a little time out of our day? Stop the hatred. Could it be? Stop the hatred. Read love on me. It's new footage every other day, every bit of it hard to watch. I'm talking to my son, he's 8. Listen to your pops. I said don't fall for the bait. The actions of a few don't reflect the nature of an entire race. Maybe the past is full of lessons, but we missed it. History shows indeed tension has existed between the two communities, but here's a fact: beyond colors, we're humans.
All right. We just want to welcome everybody to our virtual community town hall. This is our 4th community town hall and our 3rd virtual and our 4th overall. And so thank you for seeing the value of coming here. Tonight is going to be a special, powerful night. And I'm just excited that we're going to have this good time together. I believe we're all going to leave better human beings and go to our communities and filled up, ready to go and to elevate them. Secondly, happy Asian American and Pacific Islander month to all of my Asian brothers and sisters, and to everyone. We are happy to celebrate with you, beautiful heritage, beautiful history, and that unfortunately has not been told like it should have been. And I'm just excited that we get a chance to have real discussion and raise real awareness today. So I am Donald Cogdell, Director of Hope Justice from Hope Astoria Church. And our mission is to help restore hope in our communities by mobilizing through God's initiative to seek justice and peace for our city. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life, and we believe justice is a tree of life. And tonight we have an important discussion, and a longing needs to be fulfilled on behalf of our Asian American community brothers and sisters. And so with that said, we also want to take one minute of silence. Today marks the day that George Floyd was murdered. And so many of our Asian brothers and sisters have been murdered by crime as well. And so wherever you're at, we just want to take one moment to reflect and give them a moment of silence. Thank you. All right. So what I'm going to do now, we at Hope Astoria have been blessed with a wonderful pastoral team and a wonderful pastor in Denise. And she's been with Hope since 2015, has been phenomenal leading us, and she is just a powerhouse. And if anybody knows Denise, you know she's full of love and full of embrace. And the minute you meet her, you will know and you will not forget, because she will drown you in love and generosity. So Denise, opening remarks.
Oh, thanks for the warm welcome. And I just want to give a warm welcome to everybody here on this webinar. Thank you so much, Donald, our Justice Director, and the whole Justice team for organizing tonight. And thank you to our esteemed panelists or moderator for taking the time out to speak with us tonight. We are so grateful. Well, as we open, I was asked to just briefly touch on why we as a church are hosting this town hall. And simply put, it's really because of the greatest commandments in Scripture. Jesus told us that all the law can be summarized in two great commandments, and they are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And tonight, we're seeking to equip and really inspire all of us in our church community and beyond to better love our neighbor as ourselves. That what concerns others concerns us. And in particular tonight, we're looking at the AAPI community as part of a series of town halls, as Donald mentioned, that we've been having on a variety of topics. Now, Jesus was once questioned by the religious people of his day on exactly what it meant to love your neighbor. What are the boundaries on that? And he answered that question by telling the famous story of the Good Samaritan, a story that shows us in no uncertain terms that we are called to love intentionally and generously across racial, cultural, societal divides, including long-standing historic divides. And now recently, we've been collectively horrified over the rise in violence against the AAPI community. We've seen in particular the elderly and women have been beaten in broad daylight, gunned down in their places of work. It's been heartbreaking and frightening. And as Christians, it's clear that such hatred and violence go against the very heart of God, and that we are called to stand in love against such injustice. But we're going to be far more effective in our efforts to love and to effect loving and just change if we understand how we got to where we are today, right? The racism and violence we've been seeing, it's not something that's just emerged out of the blue, but rather there's a history and context that enables it to so easily rise up in this present moment. And so it's only as we recognize and name the painful realities of the past that we're then able to accurately understand our present and more effectively move into the future and create change. So, history matters. And our willingness to pay attention to the messy, ugly, difficult parts of our nation's history is an act of love. That willingness to listen and learn is an act of love. Love as an idea, I find, and perhaps you find, can be so much more pleasant as an idea than love in action. Right? Like the idea of a loving family is so much nicer than waking up in the middle of the night to change a poopy diaper of a wailing kid who's dangerously close to kicking you in the face. But that's love. That's love in action. Right? Love in action means we share not only in each other's joys, but also in each other's pain. And it means that we step up to defend and affirm each other's God-given inherent worth and dignity. One of the best ways we can begin is by listening deeply with an open heart that seeks to learn from someone else and to understand them. And so it's that kind of deep listening that I want to now invite all of us together to enter into as we hear soon from our wonderful panelists. And so thanks for giving me this moment to welcome you and to introduce our time. And I'm going to now hand things back over to Donald as we look to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Pastor Denise. I appreciate it. Such a powerful word, and often so underestimated of what it means to love our neighbor. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so now I want to introduce a powerhouse on our team. She has worked in the Obama administration. She has worked under the Mayor administration, and has done so much. And I'm just proud to have her on our team. And she's a great leader and helps lead us with spiritual care, and also helps us stay on tabs of what's going on. Grace Choi.
Thanks, Donald. So good to see everyone. Thanks for joining us for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Yeah, this is just like a very exciting conversation to have, especially as a Christian, which I think is my most proud identity, being a daughter of Jesus, our King. And I think it's just a beautiful program we're going to have with amazing women of color, and how we're coming together as communities of color to learn more about our own history in America and about the AAPI history in particular. I'm really excited to introduce my really good friend, Michelle Millben, who I had the honor to serve with her for under President Obama's administration for 4 years. And let me tell you, Michelle is just an amazing woman, leader, but really just strong woman of God. So I think I had the pleasure of leading with her a regular White House prayer meeting for staff under the Obama White House. And I have to tell you that spiritual care when working in government is probably the most powerful powerful thing. And so I'm so glad to have a sister like Michelle. She is a founder of Explanation Kids, which is a startup developing technology to disrupt civic education. Not only did she serve under the White House to President Obama, leading the congressional outreach, but she was also involved in civil rights issues at the U.S. Department of Justice. She and I worked together when she was at the White House Presidential Personnel Office to appoint people to join the Obama Biden team. And before that, she was in the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, working as the counsel, basically the top lawyer to everything related to justice at Congress, in Congress, which we know is so important right now. And I have to tell you, I mean, you may not know this just from seeing her bio, but she's also a preacher. She's an ordained minister who has been ministering. So she's been doing full-time working in government and also serving the Lord as a minister with the Alfred Street Baptist Church, and now with National Community Church, which is one of the largest multi-ethnic churches in the Washington, D.C. area. So just really grateful, sister, for you being here and for being such a great supporter and fighter on the front lines and teaching our young minds that really need that education right now. So over to you, Michelle.
Grace, I really appreciate that wonderful and warm welcome, and welcome to everyone this evening as we're coming together for a very important conversation, to join together, to learn together, to heal together. And, you know, when it comes to some of these principles we'll be talking about tonight, I know that Jesus gave us the best example that we do these things in community. And so I want to just thank Pastor Denise, Donnell, Grace, and the entire Justice Ministry at Hope Astoria for putting this night together. And I was thinking about something that the American Bible Society put out when a lot of these, the height of these cases, as we saw most recently, was from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, which compares the global church to a physical body. In verse 26, it says, if one part of the body suffers, all of the other parts suffer with it. And so we invite everyone tonight to assume our responsibility to suffer alongside, to learn alongside, to heal alongside, and care for our brothers and sisters in the Asian community. You know, our eyes have seen and witnessed over this last year and over time a lot. a pandemic, the death of George Floyd, and increases in hate crimes against our Asian brothers and sisters, with over 3,000 cases even reported this year, with anti-Asian racism and violence increasing almost 150% in 2020. Our hearts break, we grieve, and we lament for the lives that have been lost and the individuals that have been harmed and put in harm's way simply because of the destructive forces of hate. But tonight, one thing I'm resting my hope in is that even though our eyes have seen a lot, I want to remember this one thing, that no eye has seen and no ear has heard and no mind can conceive what God has in store for us. And as we're healing and believing and trusting that peace and power and justice will flow from his power, I pray that as we're learning and loving and healing tonight, that we remember that Jesus' perfect love can cast out all fear. So how will we process that tonight? Well, I'm thankful for Pastor Denise and Donnell and Grace and their team for the incredible minds they have, because they have put together a panel this evening that is just outstanding. I have expressed many times this evening how excited I am to be a part of this, but once I read these bios, you'll realize why. I'm excited to welcome tonight Dr. Jane Hong, Jane Kim, and Sharon Lee. Dr. Hong is the Associate Professor of History at Occidental College, where she specializes in U.S. immigration engagement with the world. She is the author of the book, Opening the Gates to Asia, a trans-Pacific history of how America repealed Asian exclusion. It's the University of North Carolina Press. You can find that. Dr. Hong is currently writing a book about race and evangelicalism for Oxford University Press, and she's led K-12 teacher seminars for the Gilder Lehman Institute of the American History, consulted for television programs, including Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. and American Idol, and penned op-eds for the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and more. She most recently appeared in 2 episodes of the PBS documentary series, Asian Americans. She was born in Brooklyn and raised in New Jersey, and Dr. Hong received her PhD in history from Harvard and her BA from Yale, and we are excited to have her this evening. Next panelist we have tonight is Jane Kim, and Jane is an educator and advocate. She's an educator born and raised in Queens, New York, and is passionate about issues of culture, justice, accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's been featured in Now This News, National Geographic, Scholastic, The Independent, the Truth Table podcast, and her writing has been published in Sola Network, Reclaim Magazine, a public of the AACC. Jane earned her BS in Human Development for Cornell University and her MA as a reading specialist, and her master's in education in deaf and hard of hearing from Teachers College and Columbia University. She loves reading and living out her best foodie life, which I do too, Jane. We're excited to have her here this evening. And last but definitely not least is Sharon Lee. Sharon has 15 years of experience in local government and electoral campaigns, specializing in strategic communications, community partnerships, crisis management, labor relations, and public policy. Through the apex of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Lee served as the county executive of Queens, New York, home to nearly 2.4 million residents and the most diverse county in the continental United States. Before that, Sharon served as the deputy Queens Borough president and communications director to the former borough president, Melinda Katz. Lee is an integral part of the team driving the administration's top priorities, and she helped shape public policy positions on key issues. Previously, Sharon served as the senior advisor and press secretary for the former New York City comptroller, John Liu. And Sharon also served as the policy director in the New York City Council and ran numerous political campaigns, including state and citywide races, and led various transition teams, most recently for the Queens District Attorney. So as you can see, tonight we have an incredible panel with a wonderful conversation. So I want to welcome all of you powerful ladies to the discussion. Well, tonight we've got a lot of things we're going to cover and discuss, but I want to just first start with one question. I think when we talk about these issues, especially when it comes to things that are close to home in our communities, we get straight to what we know and dicing apart all the complex things. But I really wanted to start and just ask, how are you doing? You know, with so many instances of violence and images of violence against our AAPI brothers and sisters, I can imagine this must be impacting your comfort, your mental health, your prayer life, everything. So can we just first start tonight? I just want to hear how you're dealing with this, how your family's talking about this, and more importantly, how you're taking care of yourselves during this time.
I can go first. I'm also, an educator, so the teacher burnout on top of being an Asian American woman is just, I am crawling by. I'm trying to make it, it comes in waves. And I think I try to be very conscious of what I watch and what I don't watch. A lot of the footage that has gone viral, I've been very intentional with not watching it because I think it can have a very dehumanizing effect when you watch trauma. And so being intentional with seeking out articles or written text rather than videos or footage. Also, making sure I spend time with loved ones. I think that has been especially difficult during the pandemic, and as more and more people get vaccinated and as more people feel safe to gather, that has just been really critical for me. I have been blessed to call into a daily morning prayer led by some sisters who are not in New York, and just being led in prayer by them every morning has just been a sustaining grace for me during this time.
I think for me, well, first, just, thank you for organizing and bringing us together. Donald, Grace, the Hope Astoria Justice team, and then Michelle for moderating us. I mean, I think, I had a baby shortly before the pandemic began. And so I think safety has always been something I've thought about, but then particularly now with a young daughter. So I think this has been a challenging time for lots of folks, particularly I think women, mothers, and caregivers, primary caregivers. And so I think one thing that I think I was sharing with the team in one of our earlier conversations, I think for many folks, I think even childcare has been a really big challenge and issue. And so yesterday I started childcare for the first time, regular childcare, who's not my mother-in-law. So, I mean, I think that's something that I think many folks, as we kind of, as we move toward what is hopefully the end of the pandemic, right? And what we hopefully will move toward, right, less violence directed against people of color, and particularly AAPI communities. Like, I think folks, for me, it's been childcare and just prayer. And I think for historians and scholars who study Asian American communities, I think this has been a period of, I mean, it's been a time when there's more interest in Asian American and AAPI histories than ever before. And so there's been, scholars have really been inundated with media requests and just different opportunities. And I think for many of my colleagues and I think we've been trying our best to do our part, because I think there is something, I think it's important for scholars to bring the historical knowledge and perspective to our current moment, just to remind people that this isn't new, and to actually go beyond that to say, like, this is how it's not new and this is why it matters. And so in this moment of hyper visibility, I think all of us in our different fields, AAPI folks have been, trying to do our part. And I think, academics and scholars have been trying to do theirs.
Thank you to the Hope Astoria and Hope Justice team for putting this together and for creating the space to have this conversation. I'm absolutely delighted to be on this very distinguished panel of some very strong women, very sharp women. To your question, Michelle, about how we're doing or how I've been doing, not gonna lie, it's not easy. It's certainly not easy. There is something restorative about service. And so to the extent that I can, I've tried to focus on that a little bit, but also just what we've all been doing, right? Checking in with folks. To your point earlier, Jane, being a little bit more discriminating of how much news I consume, pacing myself, extending grace to others and also to myself.
And that's, I think, I echo what you said, Sharon, that this is a powerful group of women. And I think that's a beautiful space to create, to share that sometimes, we are experiencing times where we need the Lord's strength and we need his power through these times. And so thank you both, all three of you guys, for being so vulnerable in that moment. Dr. Hong, can I just turn to you now, talk about, when it comes to learning about Asian American history and the contributions of Asian Americans to American history, or just even broader than that, general American education, covers events that are usually just the we have a couple of highlights, and that's the same in Black history as well. We'll have the Emancipation Proclamation, and then Martin Luther King had a dream. And then we have a lot of history that's left out. And so like the internment of Japanese Americans is usually in a textbook, but there's so much more that has shaped the role of the AAPI community that plays in the USA today. Can you take us into your world? Because you are the resident scholar here in the conversation. And can you talk to us about, you battle misinformation, false historical narratives, the institutional power that, sometimes perpetuates myths or neglects to mention API history as a part of the US narrative. Can you share with us 2 or 3 kind of defining historical moments in the Asian American history that people may not be familiar with? And on top of those stories, can you share how we can make some progress to ensure API history is more incorporated in our foundational history?
Sure. No, I love these questions. It's kind of, if I had to boil things down, three particular things that I would say. First, I think folks have heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so I think along with Japanese American incarceration, that's usually the topic that gets taught in like an AP US history class, for example, in high school. But, the first thing is, Chinese exclusion is not, that was just the beginning. And what happens over the next few decades is by the 1920s and 1930s, all Asians were excluded. So the first thing I would say is there is a longer history of Asian exclusion in the United States, which basically meant in immigration policy and naturalization policy, for most of American history, Asians were barred from immigrating to the US for long-term settlement. And Asians were barred from US citizenship. So if you were born outside the United States, you couldn't become a US citizen until 1952. And so that's actually really important to understanding why there's this long-standing racialization of Asian Americans as foreign or un-American or unassimilable. Many historians, many critical race theorists, many scholars in general would argue that that actually ties directly back to US immigration and naturalization policies that barred Asians, right? So that's where some of the racialization comes from. The second piece I would just talk about is the model minority piece. I think many folks have heard this term, and the thing is, I think most folks don't realize where it actually comes from, right? So the model minority is not just an Asian American thing. It was actually applied to Black communities. It was applied to various communities before the 1960s, but it becomes popularized as related to Chinese and Japanese Americans in the 1960s. But the context is really important. It was 1966, right in the middle of the rise of Black power and in the wake of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 64 and 65, and right in the middle of what were considered race riots across the United States. And so if you look at some of these early media pieces in the New York Times, US News and World Report that talk about Japanese and Chinese Americans as a success story and talk about the cultural traits that make these communities, able to overcome adversity, if you actually read the articles are actually about Black communities. So really, the model minority, instead of thinking about it as really about Asian Americans, the model minority is actually the trope. It was a strategy or a tool. It was a way of using Asian Americans to critique Black and Brown communities and to blame them for their own, quote, lack of perceived success. And if you look at these early documents, and if you look at how the model minority kind of developed and was popularized as related to Asian Americans, it's really a tool of anti-Black racism. And I think that is really what we need to understand about the model minority. And the last piece that ties directly to the model minority is in the late 60s, starting in 1968, the Asian American movement, right, which was a national movement, really started in the Bay Area, LA, but it's a national movement, New York City, Chicago, Hawaii. You basically have Asian Americans, you have Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans. They come together and they say, we're not just Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino, we're Asian Americans. And this becomes, right, a new political project. So the term Asian American, it was conceived of as a political project. It was aspirational because, these folks, they had different ethnic identities, but they argued that there was value in solidarity. And the things that are really important to the Asian American movement are, number one, the idea that, ethnic identity is important, but pan-Asian racial identity is more important. Number two, the Asian Americans are in solidarity with other people of color, right? It wasn't just, the Asian American movement was always in solidarity with Black, Brown communities, Indigenous communities. And the third is Asian Americans, activists during this period were always in solidarity with people across the world who were being affected by US militarism. So at the moment, Vietnamese, right, who are being affected by US wars in Southeast Asia. So it was always interethnic, interracial, and transnational. And that's the way that the project was conceived. And I think I think that it's still aspirational, right? We could talk more about that, right? The kind of divisions within Asian America and just the ways in which that category of 30 plus people, and then AAPI is a category of 50 plus ethnic and linguistic groups. We could talk about some of the internal tensions, but it was conceived as, again, as a political project, right? Not just as a kind of descriptive identity, but as a political coalitional project. And the last part, I think, of the question is, today the Illinois State Senate, I think, passed the TEACH Act. Illinois, I think, is slated to become one of the first states in the country to actually mandate Asian American studies, a unit of Asian American studies in their K-12 schools. And so I know there's a similar bill up in New Jersey, which is my home state. And I know places like California have ethnic studies in K-12 curriculum. So I think that's one way of incorporating these histories. Especially, and I think it's especially important to incorporate these histories before college, before they get to my college, right, to my class. I think it's really important to instill these histories much earlier.
That's so fantastic, Dr. Hong. Especially, I think what you just shared just shows kind of the intersection and connectivity that we all have in our histories. And I really appreciate you dispelling kind of sometimes there's a lot of narratives about whether or not, in times like this, especially a crisis, like where's the Black community or where's this community, and how we are all intended to be more connected. And I really appreciate you sharing kind of some of those pieces as well of that, in the sense of also too, my upbringing. I think all of us can remember our textbooks and what was missing and what was isolated and what was focused on, and how much more we need. And go Illinois too. That's a huge move, And hopefully we'll see more trends like that across the country. Sharon, if I can turn to you now, I want to just talk about your experience in the movement and being an advocate. As the president of Queensborough as well, you were present at multiple protests and rallies in response to racial injustice like Black Lives Matter, and now in response to the spike in Asian hate crimes. So can you talk to us about kind of what are some of the systematic drivers of anti-Asian hate from your vantage point? And, how would you like to see the community come together to combat Asian hate crimes?
That's a really great question, Michelle. I think it actually goes back to what Dr. Hong was just talking about, the model minority myth, when we're talking about the systemic drivers of anti-Asian hate. The model minority myth, the perpetual foreigner syndrome, it's real. And when we look back over the past, year and change, it's been a reminder. It should not be a surprise to anybody. But as Asian Americans, it's been a reminder, a daily one, of just how conditional our existence is as Americans, right? So it doesn't matter if we were born here or if we're second or third or fourth generation American, that perpetual foreigner syndrome that Dr. Hong talked about is that, we're not fully American, much less fully human. And that conditional existence as not just Asian Americans, but also just as people of color, I think is something that reminds us of just how much more we have in common than we do different in this country. The color of our skin, the tint of our hair, the texture of our hair, the shape of our eyes, our existence is still very much conditional. So you asked, how would we like to see the community come together? To what Pastor Denise said at the top of the hour, recognizing our inherent worth and dignity. And when we look at, AAPI Heritage Month that we have every year, and Black History Month, and all these months, it is reminding ourselves of the history that Dr. Hong just walked us through. Our history is American history. Black history is American history. Asian American history is American history. The Exclusion Act was a precursor of the Muslim ban from a few years ago, right? So a lot of this is not new. And if we pay attention, We can see warning signs and flags. But how we would like to see the community come together, it's really simple. It's really increasing and enhance its visibility and amplification. It's being seen, it's being heard, and to an extent, redefining what solidarity really means.
I love that it's visibility and it's coming together. I really, really love that, Sharon. And, you know, kind of using that as kind of the backdrop then for your question, Jane, I want to move to you because as Sharon has said about how we can come together to combat some of these things we're seeing, you know, anti-Asian racism in the United States has gained more attention, obviously, in the last few months because of the uptick that we've seen. But there have been lifetimes of activism work around discrimination, uplifting AAPI communities. And so I want to talk about solidarity with the Asian American community. And you shared with us, you know, your role as an educator, but even talking more broadly as a community, I'd love to know at times where, you know, for your support system of educators or folks standing in solidarity, beyond just your personal experience, can you talk about the need for greater solidarity among educators and even minority groups, and what a strong support system looks like to you, and how that solidarity and support can support other educators like yourself or other activists like yourself? What does that really look like playing out in our community?
Thank you for that question, Michelle. I love talking about solidarity because we are so in need of it. We're in so much need of solidarity and love. And what I'd love to hear from Dr. Hong was that, you know, there are movements now to include ethnic studies at the K-12 level, because we know that in the American education system, especially in K-12, that history is often whitewashed, it's sanitized. It's not that our communities are invisible, we've been erased, right? So whenever I'm teaching, you know, we always have to consider, okay, whose story is being told, whose story is missing, right? Which narrative is being perpetuated? And I think that has to apply to the broader stroke of how we look at the world. Because oftentimes our assumptions, our biases about others that we don't know are based on some experiences, but oftentimes they're based on what we don't know, right? Or what we haven't learned. And then our biases go unchallenged, right? Because I've made this assumption, especially for younger children, if, you know, they've seen, you know, their world in a certain light, and it hasn't gone challenged, or they haven't seen anything otherwise, they remain that their assumption is true, right? So we often encourage, you know, children, you know, as young as infants, and they recognize, you know, racial differences, they recognize ethnic differences, and, you know, even with infants, that they will gravitate towards those who look like their caregivers. And so we have to make sure that we are on this journey together, because we're not going to make it on our own, right? And so when that comes into calls for solidarity, oftentimes we have these narratives that I view a certain people, or I view a certain community based on my transactional interactions, right? So how they treated me at a store, or how they treated me at a restaurant. And all of these are, you know, relations based on certain types of transaction. And then what we do is we treat solidarity as transactional, when really solidarity is costly, but it's not transactional, right? So it's going to cost us something to stand in solidarity, to move in solidarity with others, and to ask others to be in solidarity with us. But it can't be a tit for tat, like, I'll stand in solidarity with you, so please show up for us. Like, I think to demand others to stand with us is often what turns a lot of folks away from moving in solidarity. I oftentimes, I know the term often that is used is to stand in solidarity, but I tend to prefer moving in solidarity, because standing in solidarity can appear to be static at times. And so we have to be on this journey. And an analogy that I really appreciate from Dr. Beverly Tatum is that if you look at anti-racism as this journey, right, and you're at the airport and you're on this moving walkway, you've got people who are like walking fast in the direction that the walkway is going, right? And those are your, you know, outright racist. They're just going at it. Then you have the people who are just standing still. They're the bystanders. They're like, ah, status quo, like, doesn't bother me, so I'm just gonna go with the flow. And then there are the folks who are trying to go against the traction, going the opposite direction. But unless you are running at a speed that is faster than the walkway is going, you can't really fight against that racism. So to be anti-racist and to really fight against the damaging narratives that we have is we have to go at a faster pace or a stronger movement against what we would say the flow or the journey, right? So what I really appreciate about Grace Lee Boggs, a known Asian American activist, is that if you look at her, you know, social media wasn't the thing back then. And she would have these conversations. There would be, you know, she would go to lectures or she would have people in her home and they would be having conversations. And I think that's often what's lacking, especially in such socially isolated, socially segregated times, especially when it's easier to feel like you're part of something or part of a movement by, you know, scrolling through your screen. And that's all important because, you know, social media has been a way where education has become more accessible, more digestible for folks, because ethnic studies, movements for solidarity shouldn't only be for those who attain a college education or those who are in education systems that will pay attention to diversity, right? Or, you know, racial issues. So I think we have to really move in a way that we understand that solidarity has to happen in community, right? It's not about, because it could easily become formative. And so we want to avoid that and make sure that we are in community with others. And to also make sure that those who do not live in diverse communities, like, you know, for, let's say Queens, right? Queens is one of the most diverse places on this earth. And in a way, for me, I had been sheltered in diversity and I had no idea of that the rest of America is not like New York City. And that sounds very naive, but for me, that concept of New York City had gone unchallenged until I left New York City. And I was like, oh, the rest of the country is not like New York City. And that shattered my understanding of what the country was like. And so ethnic studies is not just important for students or schools with diverse populations. We need ethnic studies. We need to have Black history. We need to have AAPI history being taught in schools all across the country. Hopefully we can move towards that, and that kind of movement for solidarity will be impacted by our political engagement, which I'm thankful that, you know, AAPI folks are also getting more involved in terms of voting. There's been a sharp increase in this past year of people voting in elections. And so that's, you know, a practical way that we're moving in solidarity. But just to keep in mind that solidarity is going to cost us something, but it shouldn't be transactional. I don't show up in solidarity for this so that I expect you to show it, because Jesus didn't do that for us, right? Jesus didn't say like, oh, I'm going to do this and you got to do X, Y, and Z. When we model our love after Christ, it's to love, you know, with that sacrificial love. And we often say, you know, we have to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we try to do that because scripture, you know, tells us to do that. But in order for us to love ourselves, we say, oh, we got to know ourselves, right? You can't do self-care. You can't care for yourself unless you know what you like. Like, you know, for me, a bubble bath might not be self-care because I know myself. It may not be the best, you know, option for me. So when we say we have to love our neighbor, we need to know our neighbor. So who's coming to your dinner table? Who are your kids playing with? How are we making sure that people are humanized beyond the television screen, beyond celebrities, beyond even with history that's taught, trauma or the tragedies, but we're so much more than that. We want to focus on joy. We want to focus on our accomplishments. We want to focus on our humanity. And so in a time when tokenization and dehumanization is so rampant, I really want us to make a conscious effort to humanize others. And that may just be going into your local community store and striking up a conversation. There may be a language barrier, there may be a cultural barrier. But kindness also speaks volumes, right? Kindness is a universal language. And now kindness must also always be coupled with justice. But so oftentimes we're so focused on justice that we forget kindness. So they really need to go in tandem.
There's just something you said in your comments, Jane, that were just powerful. It's solidarity shouldn't be transactional. And I think that speaks so much more volumes to the role the church needs to be playing in these opportunities as well. And I love what you just said at the very end of your statement about justice must be accompanied by kindness, and they're not divorced in this process. Powerful, powerful statements, all you ladies. I think on that point, then, Sharon, I'd love to talk about kind of like, then what's the role of the church? Because here we're talking about history and looking forward when it comes to our history, but also like instances of what we're seeing right now in the AAPI community. How can communities of faith, and get kind of to Jane's point, we don't want to appear transactional when we're showing up in solidarity. So how can communities of faith play a role in advocacy for the Asian community? And what are some of the things, I'd love to ask you this question actually, what are some of the things that communities of faith are doing currently or have done in the past that are not helpful to advocacy? And what role can we play to help, but also like what needs to stop? What's hurting and what's helping? I think that'd be really great if we could kind of just break that down for the audience tonight. I think there are a lot of people like myself who want to be a part and want to show up for solidarity, but there may be some things we're not doing that are helpful or things we need to be doing. So we'd love to hear from you on that point.
And I'll extend the burden to my fellow panelists as well. So please jump in anytime. I think we're at a time, I wouldn't say unprecedented, that's probably it's probably inaccurate, but we've got such rapidly evolving socio-political landscape, certainly in this country, and it certainly has challenged, pressure test what and how we define solidarity. To Jane Kim's point, is it transactional or is it actually transformational? I think there is, I don't want to say opportunity, but there's a chance in the faith community, in church, to create that solidarity, to define that solidarity in a way that there are very few other chances in other spaces. And the need is extraordinarily great. I think our nation is very divided. Very divided. We're in a very divisive period for various reasons. And certainly within communities of color, we're not entirely united either, right? So when we're talking about, for example, this surge in reported and visible anti-Asian attacks and hate, one of the things that keep us up at night is how is that narrative evolving, right? What happens when so many of the perpetrators are being visible by the news media, right? And the ones who are selected to be visible happen to be Black. And what does that do within the Asian American community? It requires us to make a concerted effort to make sure that that does not justify the anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism, anti-Latinx racism, the colorism that exists within our Asian American Pacific Islander community. And it's a very intentional and very necessary work. And there are few spaces that can afford not just conversation, but that transformational solidarity than the space that is grounded in shared faith.
That is just a powerful statement about the spaces available and shared faith. And something you said too, Sharon, and thinking about how we as the church respond, or how we stand by each other in these times. Jane, I want to just circle back to you before we get to Dr. Hahn, because something Sharon just said made me think about this question I wanted to ask you. We're in a world where, I think about, misinformation, and how misinformation has caused some of these instances of hate and violence that we're seeing, as Sharon was saying. And, what role the church has in combating that. I think about times and instances in history, and I ask the question, where was the church? So when you think about FDR signing the executive order that took Japanese Americans out of their homes and put them in internment camps, where was the church? You think about Native Americans, you can think about all different kinds of communities. But when we have either state-sponsored discrimination or state-sponsored violence, or just violence in our community, period, against a group, fast forwarding to today, in the politics that have undoubtedly played a role in the uptick we're seeing, as a church, what role do we have in playing not only combating misinformation, but when politics and the megaphone of misinformation really starts to come and harm a group, how do we compel Christians to stand up, speak out and against, or even take a stance when misinformation is being used against our brothers and sisters in the AAPI community?
That's a really important question. So when we combat misinformation, we need factual information, right? I can't correct somebody unless I have the facts, right? I can't just say, oh, well, you're wrong, and then end my conversation, because that won't move us forward, right? So kind of to the point that Sharon had brought up, we have this narrative in the media where certain videos go viral, and they are often of Black perpetrators. And we have to take a step back to see what is the greater narrative, right? Because white supremacy will always pit communities of color against each other. Why? Because it benefits white supremacy. White supremacy doesn't need a white face or a white body to do it, right? White supremacy is a global project, right? That, kind of with the model minority myth. I can't tell you how many times I get DMs and comments about just people still feeding into, well, we are the model minority, look at us and immigrants and all. And it's yes, but that is rooted in anti-Blackness. And they're like, no, that's not the case. And because you're only looking at part of the narrative. And so we have to take a step back. What greater narrative is this fueling? So in order to dispel misinformation, we need to learn information, factual information, but we also need to unlearn ourselves, right? Because it's really hard when you see video after video, photo after photo of a certain type of quote unquote perpetrator, the highly visible, the hyper visible perpetrator, right? It takes the step to look at the University of Michigan study, where they did a study and found that it was actually in the anti-Asian hate crimes that were reported, right? We're not even talking about the ones that didn't go reported because of whether it's lack of access to technology, lack of access due to language barriers. We're not even talking about the underreported, right? Or the ones that actually happened. We're talking about the reported ones. 90% of that, 90% of the perpetrators were white, and only 5% were Black perpetrators. But what is the media narrative that we see? What did we see on social media? What do we see in the mainstream media, right? And so it's important to look into that data. So I think church leaders, right? And I'm not saying it's just about church administration or those, everybody has a role in the church, right? We operate as a body. And oftentimes when we say the church and the capital C church, and I don't know enough about the American church, or just Dr. Hong will take that and get her book when she writes it and all of that. But, what can we do, whether it's Hope Astoria or in New York City, is that we need to be able to challenge those kind of narratives and have the hard conversations. And oftentimes the hard conversations also have to happen intergenerationally, right? So I could talk about it in my church and we're all on the same page. But if my mother's Korean immigrant church is not having that conversation, and the same myths and the same misinformation is spreading there, and it's getting spread through the Kakao Talks, it's getting spread through WeChat, it's getting spread through all these ethnic communication platforms, right? We don't know where to start and where to begin. So sometimes that conversation has to happen in the home. there are language barriers, because part of it is, trying to assimilate. Many folks did not learn their, home languages, trying to assimilate and just spoke English. And so there are language barriers. So sometimes what the church can do as an organizational approach is to invest funds into local organizations that are maybe doing translations, right? Or especially in New York City, we have a lot of elder care facilities, not just nursing homes, but adult daycares, right? How can the church reach out to organizations that work with seniors, work with adults, to provide practical access, like either educational formats or opportunities to just get to know somebody who's not Asian, right? So that we help them to not have relationships that are purely transactional. Because where are our Asian elders going to go to have, conversations that break their cultural biases or their implicit biases that they have against other people? So we can reach into local organizations, provide funding for translations. Now with video and just things being easily accessible, how can we create things that can be shared, right? So not everybody learns through a webinar, not everybody learns through, different more mainstream or scholarly or academic ways, but I think a common language for all of us is food, right? So when we are able to gather, who do we invite to our table? How do we make things accessible? How do we make things inviting, right? Oftentimes we have our church signs that says, all are welcome, and it's in English. And so is everybody really welcome when you have something that says all are welcome in English? So we have to think about, and what's the tech access? It's like, okay, yeah, you can join this webinar or join this and just log in on Zoom. And it's like, it's 15 months in and we still got people who don't realize they need a mute for a large call. So, there's varied levels of accessibility. And as a church, I think there are practical ways that we can help bridge those gaps.
Listen, you said the magic words there, Jane, food, and how that is definitely, if you think about it, to even the tradition that keeps our faith together in communion. It was around a table, it was around communion, it was around fellowship, it was around food. And I think beyond that wonderful point you just made as well, I think that's a great point to kind of, I guess, close with this last question, Dr. Hong, because I know we have to get to Q&A. But in thinking about what Jane just said about how the church's involvement, what that needs to look like. And I think it's just, I love how you also gave us some simple things, Jane, like look at your signs, right? If your signs don't look inclusive, then are you actually part of the problem? Or as Sharon was sharing with us earlier, are you causing the problem? Dr. Hong, can you talk about like some of the main reasons why maybe, I think it's education as well. If you don't have the facts or don't have the information, it's hard to move forward. And we've seen how sometimes people can become either keyboard warriors or just a part of the problem when they don't have an education. They don't have the history behind their belt. So can you talk about, what are some of the reasons why some AAPI history remains untold? And if you can, like, especially for those churchgoers here on the call, what resources could you point non-Asian Americans to read, to research, to learn from, so we can all become either better allies or advocates or just more like the church Jesus intended?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think, I can build, in terms of why these histories aren't better known, I think I can build upon things that both Sharon and Jane Kim shared. I think it comes down to power, right? Who actually gets to write the histories that you read in the classroom? Who gets to decide what curriculum is taught in various K-12 schools? Who decides where resources go? Which schools, which districts, which areas get the funding and which ones don't? I'm sure you all resonate with that deeply as government folks. So I think it comes down to power. And, I think Christians historically have a really strange kind of ambivalent relationship to power, and kind of, we don't like to think that we have any power. And I think there's a lot that I can say, a lot more we can say about that. But the other two pieces I just wanted to highlight, in terms of how folks can be allies. I'll drop a number of resources in the chat. I think the PBS docuseries Asian Americans is a good place to start. I'm a history professor. I know that folks often approach US history as kind of just like boring or stale or irrelevant to their lives. And so it's like an effort, or it's really I think many historians, we try to dispel those kinds of ideas because, I mean, history is what shapes like our present, right? So in many ways, you can't really truly understand what's happening right now without being able to locate it in a much longer history. And you can't even understand in some ways like how to move forward without understanding like what created the situation you're in today. Like, why do people think about Asian Americans this way? Or why don't people think about Asian Americans at all? There's a much longer history to that. And, you know, the parts I wanted to say, I mean, one thing that I'm going to talk, one resource I will drop in the chat is the Reappropriate blog. It's by Jen Fang. This is one of the oldest AAPI feminist blogs out there. But one of the things that Jen Fang often talks about, which I find so incredibly helpful, when she talks about solidarity and allyship, she talks about how meaningful solidarity begins with recognizing how white supremacy has affected different communities differently. But the commonality to everyone's experience is white supremacy, right? So you might have seen the term white critical race theory in the news a lot recently. There's a lot of like bills floating around in various circles trying to outlaw like critical race theory. I don't think most people even know what it means. I mean, it has, you know, so when many scholars talk about critical race theory, it's a body of scholarship. For me, I mean, I use a lot of law professors' writings where, you know, critical race theorists are law professors in many ways. Some of them are. And they basically talk about how law has racialized different groups differently. And so I talked earlier about how US kind of Asian exclusion laws racialized Asian Americans as foreign. These critical race theories law professors talk about how historical laws governing slavery, which was actually a legal institution, and Jim Crow laws, how these laws racialize African Americans historically as inferior, second-class citizens. Critical race theorists talk about how deportation laws and immigration laws have, especially in the 20th century, racialized Mexican Americans in particular as, quote, undocumented or illegal, right? So, I mean, the reason why critical race theory is so important is I think it really points us back to the ultimate culprit, right? The basis for our solidarity is that we are all being afflicted by the same system of white supremacy, right? So I think, again, I think just kind of coming back to that reality, that is what can help us find a meaningful basis for solidarity. So it's both recognizing white supremacy as the ultimate problem, and then number two, recognizing that different groups have been affected by white supremacy differently. These are just, I think these are incredibly important to kind of creating meaningful solidarity that can, you know, that's not just fleeting, that's not just transactional, right? To Jane Kim's point earlier, I mean, that it's transformational. And as believers, I mean, that's like what scholars talk a lot about. That's literally what scholars talk a lot about. But as Christians, you're like, oh, why should I care? Because Jesus cares. I don't know, it's so hard. I mean, that's so easy to say for all of us, but then like at the end of the day, that's actually true. And in some ways, like what more can you say to that? Like, why should we care? Like, why should we care that 1 year ago, right, today, Derek Chauvin, right, killed George Floyd with 2 tau among Asian American police officers looking on? Like, why should we care? I mean, for many reasons, but also because Jesus cared. And I think even, you know, even the George Floyd murder, you know, I've seen many pieces written about the role of 2 tau. 2 tau is a police officer. As I mentioned, he's Hmong American, so he's not East Asian American. So there's lots, I've seen so many really thoughtful pieces kind of talking about, yes, Asian American complicity in anti-Black racism, which is an incredibly, that is just a fundamental, that's a problem. But then even among Asian Americans to think about Asian America as an incredibly diverse category where in some ways you can talk about Hmong Americans and Chinese Americans together, but in some ways you really can't, you know, and recognizing those differences, going back to Jen Fang at the Reappropriate blog, in order to really build meaningful solidarity, you have to recognize the distinctiveness and the differences. You can't just flatten them because that's not honest solidarity. And so I think maybe that's a good place for us to start. And as I mentioned, I'll go ahead and drop a bunch of different links in the chat. And again, no one's asking folks to read like 1,000 books. I mean, that's what historians do for a living, but I get paid to do that. So that's a different thing. But, you know, just trying to kind of educate yourself and And I know how hard it is, right, to find time, but I'll drop some links of podcasts, docu-series, and even for Asian American Christians in particular, I co-hosted a season of Centering podcast by Fuller Asian American Center. We did a whole season about Asian American Christian history. And so we have some great guests. So I'll drop that link in the chat as well. So I just think, doing what we can with the time that we have, and learning as much as we can. I mean, I think that's part of good stewardship.
If I may just add, that I think it's really important, like Dr. Hong said, to make sure that the data isn't flattened, right? So whenever we see, if even AAPI are included in the data, right, to make sure that we disaggregate the data. So oftentimes, what's often used in the model minority myth is, well, yeah, Asians do make a lot of money, right? And so you're taking the like Asian, right, and you're lumping it all together. When you actually look at the wage gap and the pay disparities, it's actually, I think it's from like 50 cents to like $1. Like it's a very wide gap. So it's important to really disaggregate the data, make sure that we are not lumping everybody together, because there is diversity within what has been flattened to 5 racial categories in this American racist system, right? It's to create a caste system. And it's like, let's put you where, we find you useful, right, to be this racial wedge. So to make sure that we're going against that, I shared in the chat that AAPIdata.com is a great resource to look at for those who, like I'm a visual person, so I need visuals, and they have really great infographics of just graphs of just how that data can vary between ethnicities. And Dr. Hong in PBS Asian Americans, amazing series.
That's right. No, that's super helpful. And maybe afterwards we could have some kind of document or Google Doc or something that could go out with all these resources. I think everything you shared is phenomenal. And Dr. Hong, I want to also just thank you for bringing up the critical race theory piece, which is so important right now in the country. While Illinois is making sure Asian American history is being taught in schools, Oklahoma's trying to stop all types of conversations that make people feel uncomfortable. And something we try to champion at Explanation Kids is bringing people together who think differently. And how do you do that? You take Diana McAvoy and Hess's comments from the political classroom and say, hey, like everybody deserves to have a conversation that's not partisan, but not neutral. We can all have our particular angles on things, but we can all say, we're not going to be neutral on human rights. We're going to say there's a right that everyone has to live. There's a right that everyone has to be free in the society. There's a right that everyone has to be safe in their community, and being able to approach conversations in that way. But that's the piece right there with critical race theory that seems to be the crux in so many states right now. So thank you for making sure that's a part of a conversation, because maybe there should be, I'd say, even an education in the church about it, because I mean, there's a history there too, which we could talk about all night. I want to make sure, because we do have a lot of folks here who are with us, and I want to make sure we take questions here. I'm going to look here in the chat, and if the team would like to go ahead and just make sure the questions can be kind of sent over to us. I want to make sure we raise those from the Hope Justice team. If you have any questions, feel free to share them with Ike. And while we're waiting on that, I'd love to, maybe anyone, you guys can take this question here, but I'd love to know what inspired you, or what defining moment was personally like for you to become an advocate for your community in this way. I just love to know what pivotal moments hit folks to be called to this work. And either one of you guys can take that question.
I could just mention, I think for me, growing up in Queens is the most linguistically diverse place in the world. Got so many cultures. So I shared before that I was sheltered in diversity. I think it wasn't until I really entered education as a teacher that I was in a predominantly white space. So, all the Christians I knew were Christians of color. I was in, a Korean immigrant church, and then I was mainly with Asian Americans when I, went to college. And it wasn't until grad school where I met my first Protestant white Christian friend, where like we really became friends. And I know I'm a unicorn in that sense, because I grew up in New York City, again, thinking that white people were either Jewish, atheist, or Catholic. And I had no concept of it. And again, so I had this stereotype, I had this bias, right, that went unchallenged for all of my youth. And then that finally broke gearing up towards the 2016 election in particular, but especially just being part of a work field that is 70 to 80% white, but then also I'm in deaf ed, so that field is 90% white. So I think I wasn't aware of how all these patterns that I was seeing, all the ways that certain students were being treated, or how even in New York City, we have the most diverse population, but we have the most segregated school system in all of America. So really continuing in education and trying to figure out, how do I make my classroom a space in which my students thrive, but also it has to be a family connection. So how do I make sure that I am doing best by my learners, but also their communities and their families?
Mm-hmm. That's so great. We've got a question here from Danielle. I think it's really interesting. She says, what are some practical ways that families can walk through AAPI history and remembrance? And do you have any yearly traditions they can also adopt?
I mean, I think, the PBS docuseries I mentioned earlier, it's not the only one out there, by the way. There's actually, other films. I think PBS has been screening a number of AAPI films this month. For Chinese American families, there's one called Far East, Deep South, which was made by a friend of mine. I make 2 appearances in that as well, but it's about like a Chinese American family that was affected directly by the exclusion laws, and about, my friend Baldwin's grandparents or great-grandparents who basically moved to the South and opened a store in Pace, Mississippi. And so the film, and Baldwin is a believer. And so the film on PBS actually does talk about kind of his faith and how, his faith kind of shaped his family's experiences with exclusion, with Chinese exclusion. So I think there's a number of, kind of media. And I know, again, the reason I'm really emphasizing documentaries is that I know it's different, and podcasts, is that I know it's difficult for most folks to sit down and read books. Like, my husband hates to read. I'm a historian and my husband hates to read. So I understand, right? So for most people, especially as a family, sitting down, PBS docuseries, documentaries generally are family friendly. I'm going to actually just plug one more, which is actually not specifically Asian American, but this is something I did want to mention and flag for folks. There's a Billy Graham PBS documentary that came out last week, and it's been incredibly eye-opening for a lot of believers, because I think you'll see just different clips of, there are some Asian faces, not many, but some Asian faces in this docuseries. And I think the reason why I'm going to flag it is that, I think, going back to your previous question, Michelle, about kind of how we came to these topics and how we came to be passionate about this work. I wasn't trained as a religious historian. My new book about evangelicalism, like, I kind of grew up in a Korean immigrant church. I didn't know if I was an evangelical, but in the news, all you see is like white evangelical this, white evangelical that, right? They're like a political constituency now. And my second book, the reason I'm writing this is that I spoke at some intervarsity events just to Asian American Christians here in Southern California. And I realized almost nobody knew like how kind of evangelicals had become this political constituency, because historians actually talk about this all the time. Like, this is a whole subfield in US history. It's the rise of the Christian right, the rise of the religious right in the 1970s. It's actually a history from the 1970s onward. It's a civil rights backlash history. It's a history about women's rights, about abortion, which is very much against the news, and LGBTQ rights. It's Jerry Falwell, and it's Billy Graham. So I think the docuseries, and so what I realized at these intervarsity events is nobody knew what I was talking about. But historians talk about this all the time because it's just history. And there are like hundreds of books written about this, the rise of conservatism, and how evangelical became not just a religious identity, but a partisan identity, not just even a political identity, but a partisan identity. How did white evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals, become a really important constituency within the Republican Party? The Sarah Palins of the world, the Mike Pences of the world. How did that happen? So I would really encourage believers, like people who consider themselves Christian, Asian American, not Asian American, to watch this PBS documentary about Billy Graham as a starting point, because it kind of gets at some of those histories. How did Billy Graham become a political figure, and his relationship with Nixon, Richard Nixon. And so it's just a kind of entry point into this history, which again, scholars talk about all the time, but I think as believers, I feel like, folks should actually know why abortion is talked about as a quote Christian issue, because before the 1970s, it wasn't. And so I just want to just put that out there.
My goodness, Dr. Hong, I'm amening you over here. And I think Heather Beers, who had a question, I think there's some of the things you just went into, answered her question about the kind of partisanship in Christianity that also amplifies some themes of maybe even like white supremacy or factions that have used kind of Christianity to abuse power indiscriminately. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I definitely be looking at that documentary. I want to raise another question from Amy Pan. Amy asks, this is for anyone on the panel, what have been the benefits and drawbacks of Pan-Asian American identity as it has continued to develop over the past 60 years?
So I don't want to keep on talking. Does someone else want to take this? Or I can take it after. I mean, I think one of the kind of pitfalls is it can flatten, right? It can flatten experiences. And I'm really glad, I'm trying to remember if it was Sharon or Jane Kim, but right, that study about economic inequality within Asian America. I mean, I think I put in the chat, there was a study from a couple of years ago. I mean, in 2018, Asian Americans replaced Black Americans as the most economically stratified racial group, where the wealthiest Asian Americans make 10 times the amount of the poorest Asian Americans. And the website that Jane Kim mentioned earlier, aapidata.com, I mean, that's one of the, I go there all the time because it basically disaggregates Asian American groups. Because like I said earlier, with the two Tao piece, like you can't, I'm Korean American, and I mean, we're all, right, we all have different ethnic kind of identities, and even within those ethnic identities, right, there's a lot of internal diversity as well, right? So just because I know earlier I said, Hmong Americans and Chinese Americans, but I know that in New York City, right, I've seen those statistics, right? Chinese Americans have a 20 plus percentage poverty rate. And I think most people don't realize that. And here in Los Angeles County, over the age, it's Korean Americans and Cambodian Americans over the age of 65 are the most likely of any group to live in poverty, right? Wow. So we can even make these generalizations. It's difficult to even make these generalizations about specific ethnic groups, but I mean, so I think, if any of you are on Twitter, there's a hashtag called Filipino Twitter, which is essentially all about the erasure of Southeast Asian Americans. Sometimes when folks talk about, those lists, like top 10 Asian American, figures, like Filipino Americans, Southeast Asians often get overlooked. And the whole conversation about Sikh violence, right? So anti-Asian violence and how it really has erased Sikh communities, so South Asian American communities. I've seen a number of pieces written about that. Like, why didn't people talk as much about the shooting of, right, the Sikh Americans at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis? Why wasn't that really talked about, as an anti-Asian hate crime, which in some ways, you could argue it was. And so there's a lot of erasure even within Asian America. So I think I completely understand, right, that there are pitfalls to kind of the ways in which this Asian American umbrella has been used. But just the last thing I'll say, what I said earlier, it's Asian American, the category, it was created as a political project, an aspirational coalition and political project. And Asian American movement activists from the 60s have given interviews where they actually lament how Asian American is used today to just describe people, because to them, it was never just descriptive. It was a call to action, a call to solidarity.
I'd like to add on to what Dr. Hong said about, even in New York City, right, we have 1 out of 4 Asian Americans live below the poverty level. And that's something that's not talked about. And when we talk about undocumented people, there's a certain image that comes to mind, when in actuality, there are many undocumented Asian Americans. And so when we talk about how we can learn things and also how we apply what we learn, we also have to make sure that we are not furthering policies or means that will bring down not only the Asian American community, but also just all communities of color. For example, increased policing does not make communities safer, right? Especially when you have so many undocumented immigrants. You have, we know the effects of policing on specifically Latin and Latinx communities. So if we really truly look at how our liberation is tied together, how we are often pitted against each other, but trying to come together. I mean, Asian American as a term was an organizing force, right? It wasn't just like, let's just describe you, like Dr. Hong said. It was to part of, the third world liberation, try to come in solidarity with Latinx community and Black community and going as a political force. And so oftentimes, we hear this like, oh, Asian Americans aren't involved, or they, it's against their culture to, protest or move or, engage politically. And I would counter that with that often erases the legacy of our ancestors and our kin, right? Whether in this country or beyond, right? It's not part of our culture to stay quiet. There's been a survival method, yes, where we've tried to assimilate, not rock the boat and all of that. But if we think a lot about Asian countries and how they are where they are now, it's because of the uprisings that they've had in their own country. So to say that it's not part of who we are, I think erases a whole legacy of work. And so it's really important to know that, Asian American isn't just a descriptor, that it was actually a very powerful movement-oriented term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Powerful. Well, ladies, I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, and I think we have one more question here to cover tonight. I told Grace before this, I just feel like we need to do another one of these calls, but I just want to now ask all the questions because I'm just so impressed by your strengths, inspired by your advocacy, and more important, I think just my spirit is much more full and determined about doing my part of the work that I know I need to do to be, as a Christian, a better advocate, a better ally, and just, again, like more studied on AAPI history, so that we can all be the vessels that God expects us to be in these moments. So I can't thank you enough. But to close on this, I wanted to just ask this last question. In April of this year, Vilma Carey was walking to church in Midtown Manhattan when she was knocked down and knocked in the face by an individual who we now know as Brandon Elliott. And there were workers in an apartment building across the way who did absolutely nothing. Not only did absolutely nothing, the video footage that we've all seen shows them walking to the door and closing it. And of course, what scripture comes to mind first? The Good Samaritan. And we know that scripture very well, that story that Jesus tells. And, as believers in Jesus, we're not called to sit on the sidelines when we see injustice present. But I want to ask you, because I just, part of me just wondered, did those individuals go to church that following Sunday? Do those individuals have a church home? What is their pastor preaching that would say, I need to just close this door and watch harm being done to someone? And I think beyond the many instances of violence we've seen that has rocked all of our consciences and broken all of our hearts is that, knowing someone's walking on the way to church and experience this kind of violence targeted at them. Can you guys talk about, for those Christians who are on the call tonight, how can onlookers advocate for someone experiencing mistreatment? I mean, I'm talking in the moment. What are we called to do? And as Christians, after the moment, what are we called to do so that because again, there's a book called The Bully, the Bullied, and the Bystander. It's a really great book that's written in the mid-2000s that talks about how bystanders are basically the aggressor. What can we do to ensure that the church can just shape up and do better in this area of not being an onlooker or bystander?
I just want to quickly shout out one organization, Hollaback, HOLLABACK. They are offering free bystander trainings in webinar format, but they talk about the 5 Ds. I can't call them off. I think it's like document, distract. They have this program, and I highly recommend that folks take that. It's not all of it, but it's a step, and it's free. It's accessible. So check that out.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it too, so here I'm also going to drop this in the chat. I mean, I think, the Michigan study that I think Jane Kim and I both cited earlier, I mean, women are twice as likely to be targets of anti-Asian hate crimes. I mean, so this is a gendered issue as well. And obviously we know about the shootings in Atlanta and the 6 Asian American women who were killed. So, I mean, I think the Hollaback training that Jane Kim just mentioned, I think one of the things that's important about that training is they train people to intervene in safe ways, because nobody's asking anyone to put themselves in danger. And so I think it's really important to think about safety, to do it in a way that keeps us all safe, including women, right? Because I think this is a different kind of matter if you're a woman kind of approaching these issues. So I think recognizing the gendered nature is also incredibly important. And I think, you know, as Christians who attend churches, right, keeping this on the radar, because again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm the resident historian, so I always have to say that, you know, this problem, this is a particular moment. And it is true, there are more incidents, right? So the frequency and the severity of anti-Asian hate has increased during this pandemic, so since early 2020. But it's not as if, right, this is just like a one-off. And so I think my biggest apprehension is what happens June 1st when AAPI Heritage Month is over. I mean, my schedule clears up a lot, so that's wonderful in lots of ways, but it's like, oh, is anyone going to keep on caring? And I think one way for Christians, right, is to keep this on the radar is to say, okay, look, these Asian American people don't disappear on June 1st. You know, the media might think we disappear on June 1st, we'll see, but like emailing your pastors and just asking them to keep it on the radar, like continuing to like reach out to your AAPI communities and friends. If you are a person who identifies as AAPI, right, keeping things on the radar, obviously, and also just taking care of yourself. I mean, like, I think there are ways that we can try to keep things kind of. The last thing I'll say, though, that's something I've been telling myself over and over. It's that, you know, this is a moment, like I said, of hyper visibility, but like, just because the media doesn't report on you, like, our value and our worth doesn't come from other people's perception of how important we are. Because I know that like these things, you know, like the passing fads, like I've read all the studies about how like everybody bought Ibram Kendi's book like after the George Floyd murder last year, but then by the fall, those book sales had dropped off, and by people we mean like, you know, largely not people of color, had kind of lost interest, right, in racial justice by the fall of 2020, right? So it's we see these as like kind of passing fads, but the reality is like, you know, we don't matter because the media all of a sudden says that we matter, that like our concerns are important because other people say they are. We should, you know, so one of the things I've been telling myself and trying to teach my daughter too is like, you know, we should just value ourselves because God values us, and our, you know, I think, and finding that value and taking up space. And I think that's incredibly hard. As an Asian American woman, that's been really hard for me. You know, I'm used to like talking for a living, but it's like taking up space is hard, right? To say that like, hey, people should listen, like I deserve to be heard, and, you know, not because of XYZ, but because like I'm a human being. And so I think just kind of coming back to that, you know, I think just kind of recognizing our value and our worth, that our God-given value and worth, I think is incredibly important even after May is over.
Mm-hmm. I know we're at time, but it brings us back to the top when Pastor Denise table set of our inherent worth and dignity, and everything that we talked about today, including our visibility and amplification. I mean, that is a form of, or a tool of solidarity, which is to pass the mic and to amplify when we can. I mean, especially those stories when we see the targets of hate, seeing that there are witnesses. Mm-hmm. And the inaction of witness is just a different level of, I think, trauma and pain. And going back to where we are, the church faith communities is a unique place to address that. And if you don't mind me turning the mic back to Michelle, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this closing question.
You know, thanks, Sharon and Jane and Dr. Hong. You guys have just inspired me so much. We're going to have another girls Zoom just so I can ask you more questions and just have my spirit filled this evening. But, you know, I think to Dr. Hong's point, there's a part of this as a woman that we look to and say, okay, how would I intervene in that? I'm a lawyer too, so I'm analyzing facts and data and going, okay, so how would I intervene here? And then how would I, you know, I'm also thinking about the flip side, like could that guy You know, so could someone say I'm assaulting someone by intervening? And I'm thinking of all the scenarios, right? But I come back to the heart of Jesus. And I come back to the word, especially in the scripture where it says, before you were formed, I knew you. I mean, God knows that every hair on our head, he knew us before we were formed in our mother's womb. And to remember that each and every one of us, I think something maybe the church we're forgetting because we had that Martin Luther King problem. Martin Luther King said the most segregated day in America is what? Sunday. So when we worship, we usually are worshiping around, I know that Hope the Story is not like this. My church is not like this, and most churches are, but most folks are going to their Black church. Most folks are going to their white church. And most folks are going, as you said, maybe Dr. Hong, you had a Korean evangelical church. We're going to our churches where they're homogenous. And so our thoughts are that way, our associations are that way, and our spiritual development can be that way. And I think in some way we have got to return to the sense of humanity, not from the policy standpoint, but from where God formed us all in his heart. And I think what's happened is that we've allowed policy and politics to dictate spiritual humanity principles. And so we can say, no, it's okay to rip that baby out of his mom's womb because she walked across the border and shouldn't have done that. Or we say, no, we can strip that man of his voting rights because he committed a crime and served time in jail. Or we can say these things and they all are layered in policy, all layered in politics, but they have nothing to do with the heart of God and how God wants us to do. So I think my answer to that question would be the church has got to come back to a godly perspective on all of this. And right now, until we can remove, as Dr. Hong has said, and you guys have all shared, some of the politics that has infiltrated our Christianity, some of the partisanship that has, when we come back to God's heart and God's perspective, that is where I find that's when we can at least start the real work that you have all talked about and discussed for us to do tonight. But our hearts have got to come back to a repentance, a true repentance for our lack of this. And prayerfully, we can become what God has called us to be, especially the church as well. I don't want to take up much more time because I know we are at time. So Donnell, Grace, Pastor Denise, I want to turn it back to you. But I first have got to thank Jane and Dr. Hong and Sharon. What a brilliant, wonderful, moving time we've had with you tonight. Thank you for sharing your hearts. Thank you for lending us your expertise and for challenging all of us to move higher, dig deeper, and more importantly, speak up and stand up for Jesus in these moments. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to you now, Grace and Donnell.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was, powerful. Amazing. And the chat is buzzing. There's so much to discuss. Just thank you for that. Before you guys leave, we have some resources we want to share with you. And one of our wonderful leaders, Camille, I'm gonna let her take the floor and share some of those great resources, and then we'll close after shortly.
Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for such an amazing conversation. We have a treasure trove of resources and they keep on coming. So this is a live document. I will share my screen with you all right now. Let's see, here we go. So I dropped in the chat this living document of resources on anti-Asian racism, and this is from our justice team. We'll be updating this continually with the links that Dr. Hong and Jane Kim and Sharon and Michelle have all been speaking about. This encompasses mental health resources, education, ways to take action. We've talked about the bystander intervention training, so that's on here as well. Shout out to Dr. Hong and her book, Opening the Gates to Asia, that's on there. Jane Kim provided this amazing link where she's collected a bunch of other resources. So take a look at that, and we will send that out via email to you as well. And then if you click on this link at the top, our website for Hope Justice, we also have a bunch of other resources related to racial injustice, Black Lives Matter, housing justice, and we'll be updating that continually. So yeah, please check that out. And if you have other resources, you can send it to us in an email that's also in the chat. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and we'll drop that in the chat as well. So I will throw it over to Donald, who has a few more announcements.
Thank you, Camille. Appreciate it. Again, if we were live in person, you guys would be getting a standing ovation. And so, you know, we're gonna give you a round of applause and thank you for just dropping so many jewels and giving us knowledge and equipping us. And truly today we stand in solidarity and with you, and we have to do this again. See the emojis, they're coming in already. Thank you so much. This is what we endeavor to do is, change starts through dialogue and enlightenment. So this is not our first one, where we're on our fourth one, and we just invite you guys to be a part. We're going to send this video out to everybody, send the resources out to everybody. Next month we'll have something for Juneteenth, but it's our goal to continue this conversation and for it not to just be on this particular month, right? That we're going to keep the ball going, and I think you guys inspired that tonight. So with that said, I love the saying, let's not be transactional, let's be transformational going forward. And thank you everybody for your time. Thank you, Dr. Jane Hung, for your wonderful just expression and presentation tonight, and dropping so many jewels and just being passionate in the chat as well. Thank you, Jane Kim, for your wonderful advocacy work and what you're doing. Thank you, Sharon Lee. She was right there with us protesting on the steps and in the streets. Thank you for what you do. And thank you, Michelle, for what you do, being a powerful woman and a leader. And you guys are champions for the people, and we really appreciate you. So again, thank you. Round of applause to you. Thank you to the crowd that attended. Round of applause to you. With that said, we are signing off. Everybody have a wonderful night.